All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Rob Atkinson. I'm president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And we've got a really great program this morning to talk about the new Biden supply chain report, which has given a report that was done in, I think, 100 days. It was a pretty amazing level of detail and analytic sophistication. So we should have a really good discussion about it. I think, as most of you know, when the president took office, he committed to he issued an executive order calling for a review of critical U.S. supply chains to be completed in 100 days. And this report, which I encourage you to read, there's a link on our website, focuses on 4 key industries: semiconductors, large capacity batteries, critical minerals and materials, and pharmaceuticals. We're going to focus particularly on 2 of those today. And the administration is also working on a second phase of the report, which Samira will talk about. So I'm going to introduce each of the speakers very briefly in the order that they're going to go in, and then they'll speak, and we should have hopefully a fair amount of time for questions from you all. So Samira Fazeli is the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. She was previously the Economic Agency Lead on the Biden-Harris transition. She's worked for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, and in the Obama-Biden administration, she served as a senior policy for the NEC and also a senior advisor at Treasury for both financial and domestic affairs. Sri Ramaswamy is a senior policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary at Commerce. Prior to that, he was a partner at McKinsey Global Institute, and I had the pleasure of working with Sri on numerous occasions, as sort of fellow partners in crime on a whole set of events we did on digital technology and productivity and competitiveness. So I have a high level of respect for Sri's work there and what he's doing, what he did here on the semiconductor report, which he led. John Neufer is the president and CEO of the Semiconductor Industry Association, the major trade association for semiconductor producers. Prior to joining SIA, he was a senior VP for global policy at the Information Technology Industry Council. And prior to that, he was served over 7 years at USTR. Jeremiah Bauman is the Deputy Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Energy. Prior to that, he was Director of Federal Policy at Energy Innovation, where he worked to build an equitable and just clean energy economy. And prior to that, he led state energy policies at Bloomberg Philanthropies, and he served as LD for Senator Jeff Merkley. And finally, Brad Markell, a longtime colleague. Brad serves as Executive Director of both the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council and the Working for America Institute. He also chairs the AFL-CIO Energy Task Force. He advised the Biden-Harris transition team on behalf of the labor movement. And prior to joining AFL-CIO, Brad was an international representative at the UAW for 15 years, which I think accounts for his Twitter handle, Gearhead. I think that's your Twitter handle, Brad, close enough. So Brad really comes to this from a real expertise of how manufacturing actually works. So with that, Samira, over to you. Looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you to everyone at ITIF for organizing this. Really looking forward to the questions and answer segment here. So, I'll begin with I think the focus on supply chains is something that the president started during the campaign. There was widespread recognition last year during the start of the COVID crisis that we were so vulnerable to disruptions in a way that people had talked about in the past, but it became so salient when suddenly we couldn't get access to PPE that we needed to keep our healthcare workers safe during this global pandemic. At the same time, then this year, we've seen things like shortages in computer chips and lumber continue to raise questions about our economic resiliency moving forward. And so starting in the campaign, the president pledged that he would expand investments in the resilience of U.S. supply chains. And you saw in the American Jobs Plan, the president's proposal includes a number of proposals that are about supply chain resiliency. In addition, he took action through this executive order 14017 to say, what could we do through executive action to start organizing a federal government strategy around addressing supply chain resiliency issues in a way that was going to be whole of government. This is just a start, right? The executive order has two pieces to it. It has a 100-day review of those four products, but it also has a larger 1-year process that we're doing for 6 sectors. So I'll begin by walking through some of our findings in the 100-day report, and because it kind of illuminates how we're thinking more broadly about supply chain resiliency. First and foremost is the way we're approaching this is that we want to be able to not be reactive. We want to start getting ahead of these problems of resiliency so we're not always caught on our back foot. And that is why in releasing the 100-day reports, we also paired it with a lot of immediate actions that we were going to take to try to start addressing resiliency challenges, at least in those four critical products. Part of the motivation and rationale behind why we need to focus on resiliency of supply chains is that we think they're essential to our national security, our economic security, and our technological leadership, which is something I look forward to discussing with this group. Since February, when we launched the executive order, I mean, for those who have read the reports, we issued over 250 pages of reports. We had numerous roundtables that the agencies led some, the White House led some. We took hundreds of public comments. So we really tried to be very holistic and hear from a broad range of stakeholders in helping us evaluate and understand. Sorry, this is our standard time for having certain things happen in our office. But we had took hundreds of public comments as well to make sure that we heard from a broad range of stakeholders. So let me turn to some of the findings in our report. There are a set of vulnerabilities that and common themes we identified. So while we have 4 very different products and we wrote product specific reports, and we thought it was very important, and we still think it's very important to do this in a sector by sector way, in a product specific way, to make sure we're being strategic and smart and backed by data as we design our resiliency responses. We were able to draw out a set of common themes across the supply chains that have contributed to these vulnerabilities. Some of those include hollowing out of our domestic production and innovation capacity. So for too many years, we think the US has been agnostic about where production capacity was, and we've let production capacity just migrate overseas rather than trying to make investments that really bolster domestic manufacturing, our domestic industrial base, and US manufacturing more broadly. As a result, we've seen things like our manufacturing workforce shrink 40% between 1980 and 2010. We've lost a quarter of our SMEs since the 90s. You saw our US SMEs in particular, the small and medium sized manufacturers, fall behind large firms in productivity growth, tech acquisition. They're not making investments in production plant and equipment. We saw wages stagnate in the manufacturing industry. I think if you look back at 1978, average wages were about $24 an hour. Between 2000 and 2010, that was more like $21 to $23 an hour. And our productivity growth kind of lags countries like Germany and Japan. So, there's a lot of evidence that we've hollowed out domestic production, and we need to recognize that production and innovation are really important to pair together, and that they are very symbiotic. The second vulnerability that we identified is misaligned market incentives that promote short-termism in private markets, and how that has driven certain vulnerabilities into the system. You've seen investors often chase cost reduction and short-term profits, which has led to thin and brittle supply chains that weren't optimized for resiliency, right? They were often optimized for a narrow definition of efficiency, and we're not recognizing and internalizing a lot of the risks that we're building up in those supply chains that range from things like cyber risk, the extreme weather, or the increases in extreme weather events that climate change has brought on. So a lot of climate and natural disaster related risk, and then there's substantial geopolitical risk also in some of these supply chains. Um, and that links to like a third vulnerability, that is geographic concentrations in global supply chains. So a number of key supply chains, including semiconductors, which we're going to talk about today, are heavily concentrated geographically. Certain nodes just have either sole source with a sole company, as in semiconductors, where the whole world is dependent and overly dependent on one company, one country, for the majority of these goods, in a way that's highly risky, to everyone, like to private firms and to countries. Um, and another vulnerability is that industrial policies that have been adopted by allies, partners, and competitor nations. So um, this is both our allies like Germany and the EU, and and certain competitors like China. They've all engaged in a range of industrial policies and subsidies that encourage the development of production capacity in their countries. And some of those have been completely compliant with international law, trade law and norms, and others haven't. But to some extent, we think it's important for us to recognize that when we are in an environment in which others are adopting certain policies, we are being made vulnerable as a country, if we're not adapting and adjusting our systems to recognize that. How that places the US as a whole, our economy as a whole, in a different geostrategic and economic positioning. And then lastly, on the risk side, is an underinvestment in international cooperation. So we recognize that the driving resiliency in supply chains is not going to be solved by domestic production alone being the solution. And we need to continue to develop cooperation and coordination with allies and partners, and develop. And until quite recently, supply chain security was not a heavy focus of US diplomatic engagements or negotiations on the economic side. So the reviews then talk about how do we build from our strength. And because the story's not all bad in America. We all know that America has a lot of assets that can and should be built from, and we think we're well positioned to maintain our strength, our innovative leadership, rebuild our productive capacity in key sectors and along these value chains. What we should be building from are things like our unrivaled innovation ecosystem, our people, our vast diversity, that's ethnic and racial and gender diversity, that's regional diversity, our small and medium sized businesses, like whereas I talk about how they are weak in a certain way, um, they've been weakened in certain ways, are also a huge asset to be built up, because they've often been a source of key innovation in the system, and they help create important redundancies in these systems too, to help us not be so dependent on sole source risks, etc. And then obviously that we are firm believers in international cooperation. So we frame these building from strength recommendations across, with a few set of recommendations of how we're going to approach this broadly, both in implementing the 100-day recommendations, and then more broadly as we move towards the 1-year review, some themes that we'll be developing our actions around. Um, Before I lay these out, I'll note that it's a mix here. When you read the reports, the recommendations include executive actions and things we should just be doing as a government, and they include actions we think Congress should take. So there's a lot of intersection here again with the president's American Jobs Plan and the investments he calls for in both building resilient infrastructure and climate proofing our infrastructure, and the investments in research and development, and in manufacturing and in workforce development, and in the social safety net that pervade the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. So on the building from strength, so the first recommendation is that public investments in production and innovation infrastructure, to support ecosystems that connect manufacturing, research, worker training, and small businesses. Um, the second set of recommendations are around using high road standards that incentivize firms to invest in workers, value sustainability, and drive quality. This set of recommendations we think is really important and helps distinguish a U.S. approach to to approaching manufacturing and industrial investments at the policy level, because the American way of doing things is to unleash the power and ingenuity of private markets so that they can drive towards national resiliency. And yet we have to figure out a way to do that to correct for some of those misaligned incentives that I mentioned earlier, which so that you're doing a better alignment of kind of public values and public goals as you unleash those the power of the private market. So one of the examples we've often pointed to is that where there are some misaligned incentives and you need to like realign the incentives in the private markets, is the way that labor issues have often American workers have been treated. Because one thing we lift up in the reports is decades of focusing on labor as a cost to be managed, not an asset to be invested in, have actually weakened our domestic supply chains. It's undermined wage growth, it's undermined union density, but it's also led to challenges companies have had finding talent. We keep hearing companies say we can't find workers, we can't find workers. And we think it's important to kind of understand and dig deeper into, well, what are the practices that and norms that have been established that might make it difficult to attract the caliber of workers and retain the caliber of workers that firms want. And we have to kind of ask those kind of harder questions. The third set of recommendations are around using the power of government as a purchaser. Um, so we have a range of recommendations there, including how government procurement, like the Buy American requirements, could be aligned with critical supply chains to help us provide, demand pull and a constant source of demand for American producers of critical goods. But there are also other recommendations in the report about how do we think about stockpiling? How should we be thinking about stockpiling? And something, Jeremiah, I know my colleague at the Department of Energy thinks a lot about is in the clean energy space. How do we think about the way government buys and procures its energy and supports its energy needs in its building? We also talk about in the next set of recommendations are around strong international trade rules. So thinking about trade enforcement mechanisms and export controls both. And then the flip side to that is also about how we are engaging with our partners and allies who share our values, and how do we leverage forums like the G7 and the Quad and other existing forums. Here we call for things like a new presidential level forum, a head of state level forum, to address supply chain resiliency. Broadly, if I bring together those two international ones, I would flag for this group that we recognize that we need to diversify our international suppliers and reduce geographic concentration risk. But at the same time, the US has taken certain features of global markets, especially the fear that companies and capital are going to flee to wherever wages, taxes, and regulation are the lowest, as inevitable. Um, and we think it's time for an important rethink about that. That does not mean that we're going to produce all essential goods domestically. And so we need to work with partners and allies. We're committed to working with partners and allies to decrease our collective vulnerabilities. But we do have to think and understand how to drive markets to support the president's commitment to broad-based growth, and making sure that workers in the U.S. are benefiting, that racial and ethnic minorities are benefiting. So I'll close because I know I'm running low on time. Thank you, Sydney, for these reminders. That throughout our work on supply chains, what has been really heartening is to see that there's been a lot of bipartisan support for supply chain security and resiliency. When the president launched this effort in February, he met with a bipartisan group of senators in the Oval Office to talk through these ideas, to get alignment between opposite sides of the aisle on this. And it was heartening that the reports came out at the same day that an important bill passed the Senate, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, which is very aligned with the vision I just laid out of major investments in R&D, because that bill includes large increases at the Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation that we think are important to securing America's leadership and ongoing research and ability to be the source of breakthroughs. But at the same time, the bill also includes some of that investments in the production capacity. It had investments in the Manufacturing Extension Partnership and the Manufacturing USA Institutes, and then called for a new program at the Department of Commerce on technology hubs that would help support regional dispersion of creating the kind of innovation clusters and ecosystems often need to have to do high tech and technology driven economic development strategies that can pair production and research and innovation with worker training and infrastructure investments, providing access for minorities to have access to this to innovate it to jobs in the innovation economy. So that was heartening to see that this is quite bipartisan. And the other important part to emphasize to this work that I would look forward to discussing with this group is in all this work, we are consistently mindful of the fact that our objective here is not for government alone to take action. This is about industry, labor, government, environmental stakeholders coming together to chart a new path forward and figuring out what actions we can all be taking. Sometimes it's not about government designing a policy, designing an incentive, but more about public systems being a convener and a coordinator and helping reduce informational asymmetries and coordination inefficiencies that don't allow different stakeholders to come together and align and agree and chart a common path ahead. We think that that's a major goal of this administration. We're trying to get the economics right and the democracy right here. And the bipartisan nature of the supply chain work we think is a tremendous opportunity we want to build from, to use this as a force to unify, bring the country together for our common and collective, like economic and national security interests here, in securing our supply chains and achieving broad-based growth. So I will stop there and turn it over back to Rob, I think.
Yep. Thank you, Samira. That was great. Very comprehensive overview of sort of the findings and your thinking behind that. I was pleased to hear you give a shout out to the tech hubs. That was actually an ITIF proposal that we came out with at the end of 2019, and worked closely with Senator Schumer's office to have that incorporated. And I hope we'll see the similar component in what the House package ends up with, which I'm hopeful it will happen. I would also add, by the way, there's a place to add questions on the website, and there's also a place to vote on questions. So you can vote up questions if you like them and want them to be more likely to be asked. And now, Shri, let's talk a little bit more specifically about one of the four key products or technologies, and that's I'm not just saying this, John, because I want to be nice to you, but one can argue the most important technology in today's economy. It's kind of foundational to everything we do, and that's semiconductors. So, Shri, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. And I think folks can follow along in the slides in a nod to my previous life as a consultant. So, I think one of the things that we really benefited from a massive set of inputs that we got in terms of public comments from across the industry, from industry associations, from academia, and even the coordination across the agencies. Samira and folks at the White House did a terrific job just making sure we're pulling from the expertise across the government as well. And so I think you'll see a lot of that reflected in the richness and the insights, not just in semiconductors, but across the other reports as well. So, one of the challenges with the semiconductor situation, of course, is that there's many different aspects of semiconductor risks, right? You hear about them in the newspapers all the time. Everything from the shortage situation to fires, to the China and Taiwan equation, to stuff around national security. And so I think one of the things that we managed to do with this report was to take a much more analytical, systematic lens to what exactly are the risks. And so, Sydney, if you go to the next slide, we can just talk a little bit about some of the main risks that we identified in the report. And they fall broadly into two categories. There's the segment-specific risks. So as you look across the different stages of the semiconductor value chain, which is a really complex value chain, in each of those stages, what are the primary risks that we see? And then there's also this other set of risks, which are sort of cross-cutting where they apply across different tiers of the supply chain and different parts of where the value is created. And you'll see many of the themes that Samira had called out in the overview. You can see them reflected here in the semiconductor industry. And of course, there are certain nuances that are specific to semiconductors as well. But in terms of the segment-specific risks, so if you think about semiconductor design, where the US is in a leadership position, US companies are very strong in terms of design. There's a lot of fabulous companies out there. There are a couple of risks that we identified. One is the fact that the R&D spending that goes on is there are very large R&D outlays, and they're increasing. The costs are escalating quite quickly. And what that means is that it locks companies into this cycle where they get increasingly dependent on foreign sales, because that's what's driving a lot of their sales growth, to fund the domestic R&D. And then these firms start getting into a situation where those foreign sales start exposing them to issues around intellectual property risks, and what does that mean for protection of the R&D and sustaining the domestic R&D. So that's one risk that we identified. And the other one was the access to foundries. And the fact that we've lost so much of our manufacturing capacity here in the US means that many of these design firms rely on foreign foundries, both in terms of foreign companies and foreign locations. And again, that means there are issues around the access that they might have, the availability of capacity in those foundries, potential hurdles that might be thrown up either because of geopolitical issues or other issues in terms of access to those foundries. And of course, issues around, again, intellectual property there. And that's a particular issue where we found for some of the smaller and mid-sized companies in the US semiconductor space that focus on designs. And this issue of not having access to low volume production runs, not having access to foundries to be able to qualify and test those designs is really a risk that is building. The second stage was fabrication itself, the actual manufacturing of the wafers, where I think it's quite well known that the US production capacity has declined from about 40% or so in 1990. Now it's close to 10% and falling even further on current trends. And so that's really a risk for a variety of reasons. One of them being the other risk, which is that it makes US customers, US designers, US suppliers reliant on highly concentrated sources, both in terms of individual companies, but also in terms of geographic locations. And so there's a lot of concentration across the fabrication space, particularly when it comes to the leading edge advanced logic nodes that show up in many of the consumer electronics, in communications equipment and in data servers and those sorts of applications. There was a third set of risks around the assembly, testing, and packaging space, where this has traditionally been a relatively labor-intensive part of the value chain, where there's very little US capacity here. We're now down to about 3% of global capacity in this space happens to be in the US. And the vast majority of it is in Southeast Asia and East Asia. And so, of course, the fact that there's a lack of US capacity there is a significant risk. And that gets there's sort of a nuance to that, and that is when it comes to advanced packaging, which is this notion of as Moore's law and the traditional methods of technology evolution in the semiconductor space, as that starts to slow down, there's an increasing focus on advanced packaging as a way to continue to have power and performance and energy efficiency in semiconductor chips. And so as the industry moves towards advanced packaging and as economic value shifts to advanced packaging, there are risks that emerge, particularly because of the fact that the US doesn't really have a whole lot of capabilities, either in terms of the actual facilities or in terms of the materials and the substrates that are used for advanced packaging. And one of the things that Samira talked about was the idea of using government procurement as an engine. And there are some concerns here in some parts of the semiconductor value chain about, do we have enough defense demand to be really able to sustain those investments? And then moving further down, when it comes to materials, the variety of materials required and the dependence on foreign sourcing is a risk. And of course, on the equipment side, again, the fact that some of the countries that concern us are also countries where there are drivers of significant sales growth for our own equipment manufacturers. And so there's sort of this situation of how do you resolve this issue where you've got this dependence on foreign sales to support domestic R&D, and how do you make sure that we don't interfere with that engine? And of course, the shortages situation, which in many cases sort of predates the COVID situation, particularly when it comes to the equipment for smaller for the legacy nodes and for the smaller wafers, where equipment was starting to get in shortage over the last 3 or 4 years, and sort of the outlook for that continues to be one of shortage. And so those are things that we're looking at. And then in terms of the cross-cutting risk, of course, there's a question of fragility overall. This is a supply chain, because of its extreme concentration, is also exposed to risks, whether that's geopolitical risks or natural disaster risks, right? We saw those with the fire in Japan, with the winter storms in Texas that knocked out supply for several months. There are questions about the water use and sort of the exposure to drought and those sorts of things that does sort of apply across the board. And so those are some of the risks that we highlighted. If we go to the next page, there are opportunities here, right? And the opportunities include the fact that the semiconductor industry does create pathways to support some very well-paying domestic semiconductor jobs, both in terms of the high-skill engineering and technical talent, and sort of across the spectrum. There are a range of, between R&D and manufacturing, there's a range of employment opportunities that can be created through investments here. And of course, there are significant opportunities to advance the US leadership. There are plenty of places in the semiconductor value chain where the US continues to be in a leadership position, in a very strong leadership position. And so there are opportunities now to extend that leadership position in many ways, to enhance international engagement and cooperation. Those are things that we're trying to look at in terms of how do we work with our allies to boost the domestic supply chain. And of course, looking at how do we drive domestic US demand, whether that's through some of the initiatives in the American Jobs Plan, or other ways that we can start to bring customers to the table to say, all right, let's try to figure out how we create a stronger domestic demand ecosystem that supports domestic investments on the supply side. So I'll just close with some of the key recommendations. Sydney, if you can go to the next slide. And so the report ends with 7 key recommendations. The first of those is to continue to promote investment, transparency, and collaboration in partnership with the industry to address the ongoing semiconductor chip shortage. As folks know, the Secretary of Commerce and other folks in the government have been out there engaging with industry in a very visible way, and we continue to do that, and we continue to encourage that industry engagement as a way to figure out how we can facilitate more information sharing, more trust and transparency, so that the private sector can sort out these issues around supply chain transparency and make sure that as we get out of these crises, we aren't sowing the seeds for the next one. Now, the second key recommendation is to fund the CHIPS Act, which, as folks know, has sort of passed the Senate and is now in the House, and that includes recommendations both to fund the manufacturing portion of it, which goes back to this declining production capacity and what we can do to shore that up, and also fund the R&D portion of it to make sure that we continue to extend the US R&D leadership in that space and prepare for the next 25 years of semiconductor R&D. There's a third recommendation around strengthening the ecosystem. So as we're thinking about creating incentives for production and R&D, we should also be thinking about incentives for upstream, whether that's through the equipment and the material suppliers, where there are some risks, and also downstream to try to get more of the spillover benefits across a range of end user industries through those domestic investments. The fourth one is particularly around supporting small and mid-sized businesses, especially because over time this industry has consolidated. The economies of scale work in those ways, and so are there ways that we can support small and mid-sized businesses, whether it's on the R&D side or on the manufacturing side, to make sure that new designs, innovations are coming to the market, are being tested and commercialized, and are able to come to scale. And then, of course, the question of talent, right? The US semiconductor industry has seen some graying of the workforce. There is a dependency on foreign workers. There are long pipelines because the talent is highly specialized. And so how do we build a diverse and accessible talent pipeline for all companies in the domestic landscape to make sure that we retain those advantages? And then to continue to engage with allies and partners, and finally to protect the US technological advantage, where the report sort of recognizes that what we do on CHIPS funding, for instance, on domestic investments in R&D, there's another side of the equation, which is what we do with things like export controls and foreign investment scrutiny. And so the report kind of recognizes that all of those different aspects are part of one overall picture of how do you revitalize the semiconductor ecosystem. So I will stop there, and I will hand it back to Rob.
Sure, great. Thank you so much. It was very detailed. I encourage folks who are interested in that particular sector to really take a look at that chapter. There's really an enormous amount of detail in there. So, John, you've been obviously working on these issues for a long time, including U.S. supply chain issues. Give us your thoughts, please.
Yeah, thanks, Rob, for inviting me, and Sri, great overview of the findings of your really fine report. First of all, we're very excited the White House is looking at the importance of semiconductor supply chains. I can tell you this was not always that way, and a lot of key issues were not being looked at and addressed. So we're very excited this report is out. We totally agree with the key thrust of the report that this is a strategic industry, and while the U.S. leads, there's significant vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. That's for sure. Let me just touch on some of the big vulnerabilities identified in the report and vulnerabilities that we agree with. For starters, we heard a couple times this morning that for sure, we just don't manufacture enough chips here in the U.S. anymore. I think Sri was talking about 37% of global chip capacity was on our shores in 1990. It's now down to 12%. And in fact, if no steps are taken to address this shortfall, in another few years, we'll be down to 10%. That is absolutely a vulnerability we need to be looking at. Another one is that it's raised in this report is that we've slipped in key aspects of the innovation race. Nearly 100% of the world's advanced logic chips are now produced in East Asia. In fact, for chips below 10 nanometers, those are the most exotic, innovative chips. 92% of those are manufactured in Taiwan, and 8% are manufactured in Korea. And I raise this because there's part of the solutions are to get more domestic manufacturing here, but we also need to double down on our commitment to R&D, and particularly getting the U.S. government focused on that again. Also raised here, something that's not talked about a lot in the past is assembly test. That's the process where you make your beautiful big wafers, then the wafers are chopped up and tested and put into package and have leads attached to them. That is all back end. It's relatively not high tech. It accounts for about 5% of the value of the wafer, but it nonetheless is incredibly important in the process. That doesn't really happen here anymore. Decades ago, that function went overseas because of the high cost of labor. It was very intense manual labor involved in that part of the process. That's kind of changed. The assembly test packaging has become quite high tech now. And I think it's high time for us to look at ways to get more of this back on our shores. Another thing we heard this morning was that there are high points of concentration in the semiconductor supply chains, and that is for certain. In a report that we did with Boston Consulting Group, very fine report. I recommend people to read it if you're interested in this general topic. We identified more than 50 points across the supply chain concentrated in one region or country. That sounds kind of scary, but actually it's important to go a layer deeper and understand that a lot of those points are in regions, countries where there's not necessarily terribly high risk. So while there are important vulnerabilities to address, and this report just does a really fine job of teasing those out, no one should adopt a goal of decoupling from the global supply chains or onshoring, reshoring all of our semiconductor manufacturing capacity. In fact, in this same study that I mentioned about the Boston Consulting Group, we found that decoupling our industry and building walled off supply domestically would cost $1 trillion, take years, and drive the price of chips up 35 and 65%. that's a scenario of kind of a balkanized chip manufacturing around the world. And obviously, this is just a cost. It's much too high of a price to pay. The reality is, chips are built upon one of the most complex global supply chains out there, if not the most. We're the fourth largest traded good in the world, with $1.7 trillion in global trade. U.S. companies sell 80% of their chips to overseas markets. Bottom line, we need those supply chains and global markets to stay open. These supply chains have been a central reason behind our success over the past 5 or 6 decades, our ability to design and manufacture chips efficiently and to drive innovation. So this notion that we can decouple or balkanize these supply chains is really not an interesting one, and one that we just can't go towards at all. What we can do is, and what the report found, is the U.S. can make our domestic supply chains more resilient in the chips area, in the semiconductor area. And one thing that we're obviously focusing on, we heard about it this morning already, is to get the CHIPS funding through Congress. That's major government investments in chip manufacturing and research. But basically, we are operating on an unlevel playing field when it comes to chip manufacturing. We are a fiercely competitive industry, but when it comes to chip manufacturing, the market economics are just kind of not coming into play. And that's because governments around the world decades ago decided to begin to pump massive incentives into our sector to lure companies to build domestically. Our government has not been in that game, and that's really the big reason why the U.S. is not a great place to be manufacturing chips right now. So the CHIPS Act provides $52 billion in funding. Most of that is for manufacturing incentives, and we think this will go a long way to help kind of rebalance the supply chain and get more manufacturing done here, make America an attractive place to build fabs again, and to begin to level the playing field. So, I mentioned earlier, I think Samir mentioned that the Senate approved the USICA last week, and the CHIPS funding is in there. Very importantly, that vote was 68-32, a very strong bipartisan vote. And now the battle goes to the House, and we're very optimistic that something good is going to come out of that, so that the president will have a bill to sign. That's all I have. Thanks, Rob. Rob, I think you're on mute.
Shoot, what an idiot I am. God, how many times do I have to do these things and I'm still on mute? Sorry, I was going to say, John, you made a lot of interesting points, but to me, one of the critical ones was this notion that at least for a quarter century, other countries have been working to attract chip production, advanced chip production of their borders with big incentives. And so there's sometimes you hear in the US kind of, well, why should we give companies money? Well, our choice is we can either do that or we can say no more chip industry. That's really the choice at the end of the day. And it's sort of the same debate with the Exim Bank where, well, why are we funding companies to export? Well, the answer is because other countries are funding their exports. And if we don't, if we unilaterally disarm, if you will, then we're just going to lose. And that's really the fundamental question I think that we have to have a debate on.
Rob, can I just jump in?
Yeah.
That's exactly correct. And the other countries are not going to change their policies.
No,
they're not going to stop the funding.
No, absolutely not. Yeah. We can hope, we can wish, we can dream, but it's not going to happen, and we should got to come to that realization. So Jeremy, over to another but different technology, one that's going to be super important in the future as we transition to a clean energy world, and frankly, just how important batteries are to our daily lives. I ride my bike to work, and I got to tell you, 20 years ago, I had a battery that was that big and it would last maybe my whole ride at night. And now I have a battery this big and it can last 2 rides. So battery innovation is a lot it's more important than we think. It's not just about energy. It's about all the things that batteries do in our world. So really love to hear your thoughts on the report and what you're looking at and seeing with regard to large storage batteries.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to ITIF, and good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here. That last point was really a good transition point. Certainly one of the things you'll hear Secretary Granholm say quite a bit is that just like with semiconductors, we aren't going to have the clean energy technology manufacturing base, including the battery manufacturing base, if for the last several decades we just don't actually do the work, the policy work to compete for and attract the manufacturing to our own shores. And Rob, you teed it up quite well. At the risk of stating the obvious, batteries are just incredibly critical to the economic foundations of our economy, to core infrastructure in both the energy and defense spaces as we look to the future. They are an essential technology for a zero carbon clean energy future in particular. They enable high penetration rates of variable zero carbon energy like wind and solar, which are now on the verge of being the cheapest energy available. You're seeing utilities across the country where they do open competitive level playing field procurement processes choose wind, solar, and batteries as a combination that can meet their energy needs. And of course, they're also critical to the expansion of the electric vehicle sector, certainly already starting to accelerate rapidly at the light duty end. We're seeing more and more medium duty applications take off. And electrifying the vehicle sector is a key pillar of any strategy for decarbonizing the transportation sector of our economy, which of course is just an absolute backbone to the brick and mortar moving of goods. I also want to note that it's a critical strategy investing in a battery supply chain for the economic equity components of the president's vision for building a new long-term and equitable economic foundation in the country, in the sense that creating more jobs that are good jobs is something that is in some ways inherent to parts of these industrial supply chain questions. Bolstering the battery supply chain from critical minerals all the way through cells and packs. And then the products they're going into involves increased industrial jobs in industrial sectors that are often already more unionized, that have better wages and benefits, and then provide a whole set of economic benefits beyond the security, resilience, and clean energy and climate benefits. Let me just start by noting that the Secretary of Energy made a few big announcements these last couple of weeks as part of the president's rolling out of these supply chain strategies. Our loan programs office is working to leverage $17 billion in loan authority using our full statutory authority under the Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Program to support the battery supply chain in addition to some of its end uses. Our Federal Energy Management Program, which works across the federal government with agencies on their own energy management, is launching new initiatives to work with federal agencies to deploy energy storage at federal facilities, boosting the market for the storage side of the battery world. We also made what we think is a very exciting announcement just last week, connecting our world-class R&D efforts to domestic manufacturing, expanding the way we use the Bayh-Dole Act to make it clearer that when there's U.S. taxpayer-funded R&D going into products, the manufacturing for those products needs to be in the United States. And then, as Rob mentioned, as part of this overall supply chain report, DOE took the lead on the battery section of that. We also, in coordination with that, released a national blueprint, which you can find on our website, but which I'll just take a few minutes to highlight some of the key themes and key objectives in. So there are 5 overall goals that frame up the blueprint for national battery supply chain bolstering. The first is securing access to raw and refined materials and discovering alternatives for critical minerals for both the commercial, domestic, and defense applications. In the near term, this means, of course, working with partners and allies to secure reliable sources for raw and refined materials, but it also does mean building up our own domestic production capacity for critical minerals and critical materials. Now, building up our domestic production capacity involves multiple sources here. There are unconventional sources lithium from geothermal brine, as multiple companies are exploring in the Salton Sea. One really exciting one, we think, is extracting critical minerals from coal waste or other mine waste, which some companies are already doing and getting commercial grade lithium. This is especially exciting because one of the president's key objectives in the energy space is to make sure that we aren't leaving communities behind in the clean energy transition. And this is a place where you can, because coal mines have a lot of these critical minerals in the coal waste, coal workers and other mine workers are well suited to see new industrial jobs that are directly connected to remediating and cleaning up abandoned mine sites. That also then creates new land that's available for industrial and economic development. So there's a lot of multiple wins coming out of this kind of a strategy. But to be clear, it also means new and expanded mining for some minerals. And that's, of course, going to have to happen with the highest labor standards, with the highest environmental standards, and especially when it comes to mining with community consultation, particularly with tribal nations, recognizing their sovereign status in government-to-government relationship. In the long term, we also need to integrate recycled materials, a strategy I'll come back to because it warrants its own pillar. And we need to develop alternatives. All of this needs to really be done with a mineral by mineral analysis. You look at materials like nickel and cobalt, we just don't have that big of domestic reserves. So developing alternative strategies for lithium batteries that are less dependent on nickel and cobalt is a critical strategy as well. The second goal in the blueprint is to support the growth of a U.S. materials processing base, able to meet the domestic manufacturing demand for batteries. Even where we have production of the minerals themselves today, for example, lithium mining, we are dependent on foreign processing. So we are shipping lithium to China to have it processed and sent back. That's in some ways one of the most compelling near-term strategies is just to get that processing built up in the United States. A couple specific objectives in this space include incentives and support to directly grow domestic materials processing capacity. So that's one of the uses we think our loan program office can be helpful on. At the same time, using DOE's industrial innovation programs to continue improving industrial processes to reduce costs and increase efficiencies to make our own domestic processing industry more competitive. The third goal or pillar in our blueprint is stimulating the U.S. electrode, cell, and pack manufacturing sectors. So really developing and implementing federal policy that's going to support manufacturing across that full supply chain. We think it's really important that the incentives and direct support for U.S. manufacturing of each stage of the supply chain be paired with policies to spur demand growth. And you'll see a lot of that in the American Jobs Plan, which I'll come back to and comment on briefly at the end. We think spurring demand growth and building those markets tied to incentives for products that are made in America is an important piece of building up the domestic supply chain. But it's also connected to ongoing innovation to build up those electrode, cell, and pack manufacturing sectors. So on cell designs, we want to continue reducing total costs for cell manufacturing. And we also want to keep expediting the commercialization and scale up of new technologies and new manufacturing techniques that will help the private sector keep expanding U.S. battery manufacturing. The fourth pillar, which is a critical opportunity, is enabling end-of-life reuse and critical materials recycling at a scale and a full competitive value chain in the United States. In the near term, that includes designing and improving battery packs so they are made in a way that makes recycling and materials recapture easier at the end of the product life. It also means establishing better systems for collecting, transporting, and processing valuable lithium battery materials at the end of their life, and developing industrial processes to actually reintroduce those recaptured materials back into the supply chain. We really think this circular economy is a critical opportunity because when you've got finite materials, finite natural resources that we already have a lot of work to increase domestic production of, one straightforward source is just getting a lot of those critical materials out of the waste stream and back into the manufacturing stream. Over the longer term, that also means you've got to develop national recycling policies and programs that will dramatically increase recycling. The fifth pillar in the blueprint is maintaining and advancing battery technology leadership by strongly supporting ongoing R&D, but is also STEM education, diversity of the R&D field and bringing up more engineers, especially of diverse backgrounds, and investing in workforce development because we know American workers are well positioned to compete for these jobs. The last point I'll make before wrapping it up so we can hear from Brad and move on to questions is a few notes on how we do this. All these strategies involve a couple of sort of tactical implementation and policy implementation pieces that are critical. One is just that full range of research, development, demonstration, and deployment. You'll see an increased focus in all of this in our fiscal year 22 budget for core R&D work, including the energy storage grand challenge, including additional work on vehicle batteries, and a high priority for demonstration projects in both the FY22 budget and especially in the American Jobs Plan, where there's a major investment in demonstration projects. But a big component of it's also deployment strategies. The reality is these technologies in a whole set of market applications are already cost competitive and are already growing. Driving that demand and pairing that with significant support for domestic manufacturing and supply chains is a key strategy for all these pillars. And you'll see that in a big way in the American Jobs Plan. That includes, for example, in electric vehicles, providing rebates for families and incentives so that families and businesses can purchase electric vehicles, and at the same time, a big federal investment in building out the charging network. For batteries, that we have tax credits, clean energy deployment grants to state and local governments, grid modernization and resilience investment, and a clean energy standard that will really drive the whole energy grid towards decarbonization in a way that not only pieces all these policies together, but means investment in both the clean energy generation and the clean energy storage technologies that batteries are such a critical component of. And then all of that is, of course, paired with tens of billions of investment in and incentives for building up domestic manufacturing, including specific programs for clean energy, which includes batteries. And then finally, again, even that R&D can be connected directly to domestic manufacturing by making sure that across government, as we invest in R&D, we make sure those technologies are being produced in the United States. Why don't I wrap up there and let's hear from Brad and then see what questions and discussion people are into.
I'm on mute. Thank you, Jeremiah. And that was great. Brad, over to you. You're on mute as well. There we go. Wonderful.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks to everybody who went before me. So many great points to be made. I'll talk a little bit about the battery piece of it. I associate myself with everything Jeremiah said. I think those that have worked with me know how any mention of doing better on the Bayh-Dole Act warms my heart. It warms the heart of union members everywhere because there's a key competitive angle there that I think two or three people mentioned about the link between innovation and production, going back at least in my mind to the work of Willie Shee and some of the things he did. And it's really important for us to think about the technologies of the future, and advanced lithium-ion batteries are one of those enabling technologies, as Jeremiah said, both for transportation, but also for the electricity sector. If we're going to electrify our economy as a way of beating the climate crisis, storage is going to be a big part of it, and EVs are going to be a huge part of it. We really appreciate the work. This report is outstanding, top to bottom and side to side, and as was mentioned, for 100 days, really a lot of hard work, but also sort of exposing the deep expertise that is in the federal government and really making it clear that we have the ability to do better on supply chains, to do better on the technologies of the future. As somebody who was born and raised in Michigan, spent most of my life there, most of my life in the auto industry, Secretary Granholm, when she was the governor, understood the really critical nature of winning on batteries and took action in the 2009-2010 timeframe to try and stand up some battery plants in Michigan. Was maybe a little ahead of the curve, I think, but we realized in a piece that the Department of Commerce put out in 2005, Ralph J. Broad, a familiar name in these in this sector. Why are there no large-scale rechargeable battery manufacturing in the United States? Part of it was trade, and the fact that the customers for lithium-ion batteries, rechargeable batteries, were in Asia because electronics were being produced in Asia. Part of it was that in that environment, manufacturing batteries was a low-margin part of the business, and companies really didn't see the return to manufacture in the United States. Some of it was labor costs. I think John mentioned that earlier. Hopefully, we're getting past that now, getting to a place where the economy is being rebalanced a little bit, where good jobs and union jobs are a thing that we can talk about. The labor movement has really been on the edge of pushing out on this trade argument, and there's a lot to be done there. We really, really are supportive of what Ambassador Tai has said and what President Biden has said about a worker-centered trade agenda. But the truth is, we have never had our act together here at home with respect to these critical industries, the manufacturing, in some cases even the tooling, and the work on the battery supply chain that's in this report really shows, starting at the mineral level. We have to be able to have a domestic supply of some of it, not all of it. And as was mentioned in terms of cobalt and nickel, perhaps, we need to design away from them. But there are some good examples going on out there of what's happened. The Thacker Pass lithium project is extremely interesting. And if you take a look at what the company is proposing, they're trying to do low impact mining. They're going to recycle water. They want to run energy intensive processing on renewable energy. That's the sort of broad set of goals that we can achieve if we would just pay attention to it. And that's what this report, I think, the value of it in the battery sector especially is, hey, let's just pay attention to this. There are a number of pieces of it that we want to pull together. I guess I want to validate and emphasize what Jeremiah said about the market. It's really important for us to develop a market here, and that means driving strong fuel economy standards and encouraging companies to get into the EV space. Both Europe and China are way ahead of us on that. And ultimately, the battery manufacturing and the automobile assembly plants are sort of the top of the food chain. And if we attract those and if we can stand those up in the United States, then we'll be very successful at helping the second and third tier companies find markets and find success. Really, really important that this report emphasizes good jobs and union jobs. That for manufacturing workers is a big key to how we're going to be successful. As Samira said, real wages in manufacturing have been lagging, or in the auto industry declining. We've seen a lot of dislocation. 25 years ago, African Americans were overrepresented in manufacturing. Today, they are underrepresented in manufacturing. That has a lot to do with where manufacturing used to be and where it is today. And the reseeding of a strong battery sector, a strong semiconductor sector, is not just an opportunity to be more secure in our supply and to be more resilient. It's an opportunity to meet diversity and good job goals. And it will be remiss if we don't take this chance to hit those goals. There are a number of things out there. Samira mentioned the short-termism and the agnostic nature of how capital decisions are made. I think, the world that those decisions are premised on, I think it's pretty certain that world doesn't really exist. It was theoretical. It was good. I'm old enough to have been around and got to learn a little bit from a management consultant named Edwards Deming. One of the 14 points was to stop doing business on the basis of price alone. I think we've arrived at a moment where we aren't going to be doing business on the basis of price alone. Price is certainly important. You have to meet price in the marketplace, or you can go out of business over the long run. But we have to have some broader stakeholder type of decisions. There are some things, that aren't here that we're very concerned about. Currency drives a big part of how manufacturing could be profitable or not profitable in the United States. I really take John's point about the need to match other nations and what they're doing purposely to attract semiconductor manufacturing. There's a concern we have. I maybe could put it in the parking lot for purposes of this discussion. Local incentives are just about out of control, and you're seeing companies asking for 1/3 or 40% of their capital costs or their total costs to be covered by state and local governments in order to locate a factory there. We've got to make the U.S. more attractive so that that's not the only way we have to land attractiveness, attract capital investments. I think I just want to wrap up really with this plea that this supply chain work is important, but it has to be seen and it will be successful in the overall context of what the Biden administration is proposing. So the American Jobs Plan, the US ICA, what we're doing in demonstration projects, really kind of muscle learning for workers, for companies about high techs. I could not agree more. And, really congrats to ITIF about the hubs. We think that the hub concept is a great way to talk about what we need to do, both in terms of innovation and production, also in terms of clean energy, things like hydrogen. We're going to have regional development of hydrogen hubs if we're going to move into that technology and make it successful. The last thing I will say is this is a marathon, not a sprint. We need to move on semiconductors and clean energy over a period of 10, 20, 30 years. But on batteries, especially, it's important not to get left in the dust right out of the starting gate. And I think that's the emphasis that we would put on. What is happening in the next 5 years is going to be really critical. I think if you look at the overall program between the investments, the tax credits, and what we're doing to drive our supply chain, that's a recipe for success here. So we've got to hit all those marks in order to win in this contest.
Brad, thank you so much. That was great. My advice to anybody running a marathon, the most important thing you can do to win a marathon is you actually have to start. And to your point, it is a long-term thing, but we've got to start. And that's why I think this report is so impressive. And then obviously the Senate Act and all, we're finally beginning to get off the blocks and start to run. And we can't just do it today and tomorrow. We're going to have to do it for a long term. I had a bunch of questions I could ask, but I'm not going to do that because there's a bunch of good questions from the speaker, from the audience. But I want to ask one, which is maybe to Sri and John, which is, how do we make sure that the CHIPS Act funding doesn't just go to firms this is the question, that don't need it and won't change their behavior? In other words, how do we make sure that this is an additive thing? It's really going to be a boost and not just support what would have happened already. I don't know, Sri or John, if you want to jump in, Sri.
I can take the first crack at it, and then I will leave it to John. I think, look, it's a great question, and it is one of the questions that we're thinking through ourselves. I think right now, as we think about the incentive designs, certainly what you see in the language in the legislation is reasonably flexible. And so I think there is this question of how do you make sure that you really are plugging a cost gap? You're not just, this is not a handout. And then also, how do you make sure that you do it in a way that sustains the private sector investments? Certainly one of the things that we've been looking at is, we're expecting the private sector to be significantly stepping up their investments, right? So we look at this as a co-investment plan, not a grant program in that sense, even though, of course, technically it is a grant. So certainly, one of the things we're thinking through is that sort of incentive design to make sure that you're closing a cost gap, you're triggering a whole bunch of private sector investment in response, and that private sector investment comes with a broader spillover benefit, which is why the report talks about this need to build an ecosystem both upstream and downstream, and with the smaller and mid-sized companies that also benefit from those investments.
Great, thank you, John. Want to
Yeah,
add to that?
that's a great question, and totally on board with Sri's explanation and answer as well. But I will say that the way this thing is structured is, sure, there's going to be grants involved, but there's going to be far more investments required from private sector players, and these are solvent companies that have to have a lot of capital to be able to do these kinds of investments. Fabs, the most leading edge fabs in logic cost $30 billion. That's a couple of aircraft carriers. So the players in this space are active, vibrant, viable players in anyway. And there's one other kind of related suggestion, is that, maybe this is not so market oriented. Well, we got to do something, otherwise we just kind of tip into the abyss in terms of our manufacturing, unless the U.S. government steps in. But one critical fact is that over the next 10 years, there's a projected 56% increase in manufacturing capacity demand coming online because of the explosion of demand for chips and AI and quantum computing, electric vehicles. So we know there's a huge demand for chips coming at us. So kind of a super cycle is, and we may even be in one, for demand for chips. So it's not a question of whether these fabs should be built because there's market demand for them. It's a question of where they're going to be built. Do we want more of them built here, or do we want more of them built overseas?
I think one other thing I would add here is the federal government. Some parts of the federal government have actually a great experience and track record working with the private sector to design goal-oriented contracts or grants or cooperative agreements across NASA and Department of Defense. They, in the Department of Energy, all have had to work to make sure that money was well spent, drove innovation, taxpayer accountability was met, and there was that balance between private profit and public goals and mission. And as we at the federal government and have been working with the Department of Commerce to support them, we're really making sure that there is a whole of government support supporting the Department of Commerce as they move into doing this area of work, which is something, again, a lot of federal agencies know how to do well. And the Department of Commerce is being supported and built up so that it can also develop and implement from those best practices.
Rob, you got to get that mute button under control.
I got to get that mute button under control. So I want to go to a couple of related questions, and they go to incentives. We've just been talking about an incentive around semis, but the question is, what U.S. strategies and resources are available to help U.S. companies reshore or international companies invest here, not just in semiconductors? And then also a related question, are there any incentives, including tax, that encourage companies to make a better trade-off between maximizing short-term profits and supporting U.S. National interests? Some of that's obviously we just want a better sort of innovation and investment climate, better skills, better infrastructure, a lot of what the president's plans have been focused on, but some of it may be also specific. So I'm just curious if anybody wants to address that.
I could do it broadly, and then
Sure.
Jeremiah, you might want to lean forward because your agency has so many great tools here that probably should be elevated. I would say broadly, as we were doing these reports and as we move towards implementing the recommendations in these reports and also doing our 1-year supply chain reviews, we definitely have identified a range of possible tools that could be brought to bear across many different supply chains. So we're going to look closer at the Defense Production Act. And this year, the federal government and I think the country kind of rediscovered this power, this legislative authority and this regulatory authority, it's not that well understood still, right? There are many different parts of the DPA. There's incentives, there is an information sharing and collection component to it, and then of course there's the priority allocations piece. And so we are going to be pulling together the agencies to understand, like, what have we learned, what has worked well in the DPA, how can the agencies better leverage and use their existing DPA authorities to support supply chain resiliency objectives. But we think of that really broadly because the DPA is not just about financial incentives, and it's not just about priority allocations. You have to remember that there are a range of tools and powers there. We also in the reports call attention to the XM and thinking about how the XM and its financing tools can be better used here. So we definitely look forward to ongoing conversations with others about what are reforms, improvements, changes at XM, and how those can be better aligned. On tax, I would say more broadly, it's a core part of the president's tax agenda and tax reform plan to make sure we're getting away from a set of incentives that we think overly incentivize offshoring, and offshoring even, and we think that there should be more targeted incentives designed to support research and development, but that the Trump tax credits and tax reform just didn't get that balance right. And so we know that we're happy to see that the G7 move forward in its commitments, and in the international negotiations there, we saw the at least 15% language in citing the support for that in global tax reform. So on tax, I think we're working on that. We're focused on it, and we look forward to ongoing conversations with folks, including on this call, about what are the proposals they want us to see, and we continue to have that dialogue with the Hill as well. Jeremiah?
Yeah, thanks, Samira. A couple of just specific tools to talk about in terms of incentives for manufacturers to locate in the U.S. in the battery space and in the clean energy space broadly. With existing tools, the sort of biggest, shiniest object at the Department of Energy tends to be the Loan Programs Office. We've got two different programs there: the Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Program, which can invest in manufacturing throughout the vehicle supply chain, including batteries. And we're currently working through with our lawyers to see if we can go all the way up to some of the critical minerals production and processing. There's also the Title 17 loan program, which supports other clean energy and decarbonizing technologies. So we think for a whole range of technology, that Loan Programs Office can be helpful. I will say we're seeing a huge uptick in interest. I think just the other day, Jigar Shah, who's running that program, told me that we've gotten more interest in the last 30 days than the prior year had seen in terms of billions of dollars of applications coming into the program. So certainly the American Jobs Plan is a critical strategy for increasing the capital available in programs like that, both at DOE and across the government. There are also other targeted programs. I would actually say companies should feel free to reach out to DOE because each of our program offices has specific R&D programs that they partner with the private sector on. And that R&D often extends into demonstration in ways that can involve working with U.S. manufacturers to scale up specific technologies that we're attempting to commercialize. The other point I would mention is that there are across government some sort of specific programs that overlap here. So the one that comes to mind is the Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities. Part of President Biden's agenda to make sure that regions aren't left behind in the clean energy transformation of the economy is working across agencies to identify economic development resources that can help coal and other energy producing regions that are seeing declines in jobs and economic support right now, not just in Appalachia, but certainly Appalachia is a priority, but also in the West and other areas. And within there, certainly we are actively looking for ways to support manufacturers that would create jobs in some of those communities and places. And then, of course, just briefly in the American Jobs Plan, there are a couple different programs that, assuming that gets across the finish line with the level of investment that the president is calling for and the nature of investment, you've got both increased loan programs for manufacturers, as well as some grant programs, allocated tax credits like 48C, that support capital investment in new or retrofitted manufacturing facilities. So there's a lot of tools there that I think would really, especially for a lot of these places where, as Brad mentioned, the world's ahead of us on some of these technologies. They're moving faster on electric vehicles. They're moving faster on battery manufacturing. Jump-starting that, both with supporting the manufacturing side and the demand side, can happen very quickly because the technology is ready. But it needs that sort of scale of fast investment that the American Jobs Plan really represents.
Great. I want to turn it over to Sri, but make a moderator's prerogative of just a couple quick things. One thing that we are really focused on now, and that's the R&D tax credit. We just released a report from a couple of leading economists on that, and we rank out of 34 countries, OECD and the BRICS. We rank 24th in R&D credit generosity. And I know the president at one point talked about how important that is. But also, if the last tax bill, 2008 bill, expires in this particular provision of R&D expensing rather than amortization, we fall to 32nd out of 34th in terms of R&D taxes incentives. So to us, that's pretty critical. Last one also is SBA. We tend to lose sight of SBA on this, but last time we looked, SBA provides very, very small amount of loans to I'm going to say something like 7% of its portfolio is to manufacturers. It may be a little different. Seems like that's a really, the 7A and other programs. So we could be doing there. Sri, you had some other comments I think you wanted to make.
Yeah, I think just in the spirit of, somebody said this is a marathon, right? And we're just starting off the block. So I think that is exactly the right mindset. And so one of the things that hopefully is coming next is, there's this broader supply chain resiliency program that we've been discussing as part of the American Jobs Plan, which is sort of a re-envisioning of what it takes to build robust and resilient supply chains here in the U.S. and working with our allies and how to get more domestic investment into those critical industries. And we know that can change over time. And so this is really trying to get at the fundamentals to try to make sure that, you're not just reshoring a supply chain here and a supply chain there. This is fundamentally rethinking the economics of these supply chains to make sure we're making these changes. And the other thing I would add is, the other part of the marathon is this administration is pretty serious about engaging with the private sector, whether that's on the labor market side or on the capital market side. I think there's a recognition that you're not going to solve this problem without American labor and American capital fully invested in these programs. And so that's part of, I would encourage folks who are on this call and even outside, engage with us. We are looking to engage, we're looking for ideas. And so, we've certainly demonstrated that, I think, over the last 3 months. You've seen the richness of these reports, and we hope that engagement continues.
No, that's right. Samir, did you want to add to that, Samir?
Yeah, I did. And I know Brad wants to jump in too, so I'll give him a chance too. But one, I appreciate you lifting up SBA because as part of the American Jobs Plan, we also think that the SBA's role in manufacturing could be strengthened and expanded. And, we continue to talk to folks on the Hill about where there are opportunities to do that and to write new legislation and authorize the SBA in the right ways to support this work. And similarly, in the American Jobs Plan, we're looking at how that supply chain resilience program at Commerce could have access to capital and financial tools paired with it. In USICA, the bill included a supply chain resilience program at Commerce that was just monitoring and studying and understanding the problem. But we think it's not enough to just study it, and it's important for that also be paired with some tools towards intervention. And before I turn it to Brad, because this is something he and I talk a fair amount about, and to build on what Jeremiah said, we need focused support for modernizing, retooling the auto supply chain and the auto sector in particular, so that we can reposition those factories now, today, to move from internal combustion engine to the electric vehicle production instead. And that's going to require both new funding and new authorizations to get done right. But Brad, I'll turn it over to you.
Well,
Brad,
Samir,
before you jump into that, can I just want to also add one of the questions I was going to ask you, and maybe you could tie it into your answer to this, is there's a lot of mythology out here that this is all about big companies, big battery makers, big semiconductor companies, big auto. And you had noted supply chain and SME. So if you could just also touch on that in your response, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I mean, so that is why we think the supply chain program at Commerce, SBA needs to be strengthened, and manufacturing extension partnerships. Like, if we do not provide a set of incentives, tools, technical assistance to our small and medium-sized manufacturers, and we will not have built a more resilient domestic industrial base, and we won't have that kind of innovation and competition that has always been the hallmark of America's leadership. Like, the way we stay as a leading country is that we bring in new innovation, we bring in new companies, and we don't just pick national large winners and just keep reinvesting in them. And so that's why a large part of the American Jobs Plan is providing for a range of supports for small and medium-sized companies, so that they can be strengthened and they can be a focus of this work.
Great, thank you. So Brad, sorry to interrupt you. Over to you.
Thanks, Rob. And Samira, that was a great lead up to this idea of place-based strategies that we talk so much about in the just transition space, and I think we talk about it in the auto space too, right? You can map where engine and transmission plants and all their suppliers are, and we should be trying to drive investment to those places. The 48C that is out there, passed through Senate Finance, contemplates that by dedicating half of its investments to former coal communities. I think there's an argument around auto communities as well. And it really is going to be important to making this all work to have place-based strategies. I would tack on a few things. Look, one thing I really appreciate is the emphasis on tooling and tool making. We've got a hollowed out tool making sector here, and those are generally smaller SMEs, right? That are, your $5 to $10 billion companies, say, really making a lot of the sophisticated tool making. And it sounds weird to say a $5 billion company is small, but perhaps that's the way things are today. I really focus a lot on this investment, environment that we have, right? And Congress has to do its job to make all these things, come to life and change what the investment environment is for manufacturing. And I harp a lot, and Samira's heard it, about the cost of capital. If you go to NYU Stern's, they maintain a public page on cost of capital. The cost of capital in the auto sector is over 10% today. That's ridiculous in today's environment, but it's reflective of the risk that is seen by capital markets in these manufacturing sectors, given the environment that we've got them working in for the past 20 or 30 years. So this big package of things that the administration has proposed, that Congress has on its plate, not only are important to get us started and get us moving down the road, it's going to change the risk profile of investing in manufacturing in the United States and really leverage private capital that way.
That's great. Thank you, Brad. So we have 2 minutes left, and maybe I'll turn it back to Samira for a couple of closing comments. In particular, where do you see all this work going in terms of continuing analytical and policy recommendations, and then perhaps maybe on the Hill as well?
Sure. So where this work is going is, if you look at the recommendations in the report, we're going to have a bunch of working groups internally that are going to be tasked with like driving those forward and actually implementing them, the ones where we have executive authority. And so you can expect us to maintain come meet with the agency's posture of like, we're going to continue to want public input and engagement and helping shape how we implement those recommendations. We also have the 6 industrial-based studies that we're now undertaking, and those are going to cover the defense industrial base, the energy industrial base, the food and agricultural industrial base, the information and communications technology industrial base, and the health and biological preparedness industrial base. I think going forward, you'll see us run some of them have already done some early public comments already to the public, but we'll continue to take public comments and hold some public outreach related to helping us analyze and take the methodology and approach we developed in the 100 day and now apply it at a sector level to make sure we're analyzing these and coming up with reports that aren't just reports that analyze risk, but actually try to offer a broader strategy of like, here is the state of that sector, and here are some directions in which we think U.S. policy needs to go to strengthen that sector overall. So that's some of what's coming down the pike here. I think legislatively, I mean, this is Washington. No one tries to predict what Congress is going to do and what Congress is ever going to do. But I mean, like you, we're optimistic, cautiously optimistic that the House will take action on USICA, but nothing can ever be taken for granted in this town. And we think it's important to make sure that I mean, we are doing our best to engage with our colleagues up there on Capitol Hill, provide technical assistance as they ask us to, but we're hopeful that the House will take action because we think that bill is very, very important to moving us forward on supply chain resiliency. I think it reaffirms. It's exactly what you said. It's the start. We got to start the marathon. And to the president's point, we need to prove to the world that democracies can work. And that bill passing is a sign to the rest of the world that America is back. We're back after 4 years of the rest of the world kind of looking at us like, like we're headed in the wrong direction. And it will be such a major boost to our kind of global image and start to position us in the right world in the global kind of economic competitiveness landscape if we can get that bill to pass. So I really hope that we can get a broad coalition together behind supporting that bill's passage, and then for the larger AJP and American Jobs Plan and American Families Plan next, because those are all going to be essential parts of making sure we get this all done right.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you. And I think your point is a critical one. Is it's a lot easier to do this if the Hill, and particularly the House right now, hears from all the stakeholders and hears how important that is to the business community, the labor community, to universities, to all sorts of other groups, professional associations. So I know that's been happening, but we're close to the finish line. This is maybe one of those things where we've started the marathon and we're close to the 1 mile finish line. And we got to get to that first mile before we can win the race. So enough of these bad analogies.
We could trip and fall at any moment.
Exactly.
So let's not get cocky. I don't know if we're a mile out or how close we are to that finish line yet. So we got to all stay diligent and focused on getting through the marathon.
Exactly. And keep passing the baton, not dropping it. So, well, this is fantastic. I really appreciate all my administration colleagues here for joining us and doing this and telling everybody about this important work. And it really is a breath of fresh air. It's fantastic. I'm Samira, like you. I'm cautiously optimistic, and I'm looking forward at some point to breaking out some champagne, ideally in this year, for all this to happen. So again, thank you, Shri and Jeremiah, Samira, John, Brad, and thanks everybody who's listening. Appreciate the questions you asked, and we'll look forward to seeing you at another ITIF event. So thank you.